So here I would like to invite you to talk about what we call social remittances. This is an example of social cultural change occurring as a result of migration. Let's define first what I understand by social remittances. So social remittances are, and here let me read the definition for you, values, practices, identities, and social capital that circulate between the sending community and receiving community, that circulate between. So this exchange can happen both ways. And the first to introduce this concept of social remittances, that, just to remind you, are values, practices, identities, and social capital that can be exchanged between the place of origin of migrant and place of destination. This concept has been introduced by Peggy Levitt, an American author. And together with Izabela Grabowska, Michał Garapich, and Ewa Jezwicka, I have described the social remittances happening between United Kingdom and Poland in a book called Migrants as Agents of Change. Social remittances in an enlarged European Union. And as follows, I would like to tell you about the outcomes of a research about social remittances between Poland and United Kingdom. But let's go back to theory a little bit. So what are the things that people can transfer between the place of origin and the place of destination? So we have found that there are three sets of things that can be exchanged between the place of origin and place of destination, and can become a part of the social cultural change occurring as a result of migration. And those are things, those are material stuff, ideas, and practices. Things are obviously material objects that may acquire social sense as a consequence of migration. So we can have an item that gets a very different meaning as a result of migration. It can be a symbol of status. It can be an innovation, but it can also be contested, as we will see in a bit when I will give you examples. Things concentrate various social meanings and can be polysemic, that is, can have different meanings. They can be contradictory, ambiguous, depending on their use. So let's say, for instance, let's look at the example of a Wellington boot. For Poland, these type of boots are the boots that you use to work in the field when you work in agriculture. Whereas here in the UK, expensive Wellington boots can be a status symbol, used, for instance, to walk your dog or go to relax in the countryside. So obviously, this is something that more affluent people can acquire, and it's not it. And these Wellington boots for migrants who live here in the UK is not only for the farmers, something for the farmers, but also for middle class people who use it not for work but for leisure. The other thing that we can acquire and that can be transferred and transferred back to the place of origin are ideas. And by ideas, we understand values and more general reflections about the organization of social life. So, for instance, those can be new values regarding the political sphere, economic, but also moral realm, ideologies. And finally, what we acquire are the practices, behaviors connected to internalization of the social world. And when talking about the social remittances, we should look at three different stages of the process of sending these new things, ideas, or practices back home, as in case of Polish migrants who live here in Britain. So those stages of the process are as follows: acquiring, transfer, and effect. So acquiring is when an individual is learning something new. For instance, observes middle-class people who use their wellies, not to work in the fields, but to walk their dog. Then transfer is the process when this individual who has learned something new, who has observed something new, who is transferring, is moving, is passing this new idea to a larger community, be it their family, their peer group, back in the place of origin. And finally, the last stage of this remitting is the effect. Whether this novelty, an idea, a thing, a practice is accepted and gets adopted in the wider community of practice. So what happens at each of the stages? As follows, I would like to tell you about the possible effects to each of the stages acquiring, transfer, and effect, and give you practical examples of these. And those practical examples will be quotations from the interviews with Polish migrants in the UK and Polish returned migrants back in Poland. So when it comes to the first stage of the process, that is acquiring, though the three possible reactions are there are three possible reactions, and they are as follows: resistance, imitation, and innovation. Resistance, when somebody says, no, I don't like what I'm observing in the receiving society. And here an example of Martyna, who comes from a Polish town of Sokółka and lives in London. And Martyna told us about the dietary habits of the British people that she could observe, something that she wasn't that she didn't agree with. So, namely, we are talking about the use of ready-made products. And Martyna says, what they eat and how it affects their bodies is terrifying. I don't like it. They buy ready-made food and put it into microwave. So she was saying about a certain eating habit of buying ready-made food. Obviously, this is a habit that she could observe among her colleagues and friends here in the UK. I don't say that this is something that everybody does here. Obviously, it's also very much class related to income. But without going into these details, let's look at the resistance of Martyna towards this migration novelty, this novel thing that she observed. And here we are talking about a practice, eating practice. So she says that it is terrifying for her, and she says that she doesn't like it. So we can assume that the acquiring of this new practice will not happen because she doesn't like it. She doesn't agree with. So here the social remittance will not occur. Another possible reaction to acquiring a novelty is imitation. And here, let me give you an example of imitation of acquiring through an imitation of an idea, namely the open and acceptance, being open and acceptance of LGBT people. So Mirek, who comes from the same town and also migrated to the same city, told us, if somebody is gay, they want to get married, they should do it. I don't know them. I won't pry into their business. we asked him, "Have you always thought like that, or the life in London taught you a lesson?" He answers, "Earlier, I haven't thought about it, because I haven't seen it. In Poland, I didn't see such people, LGBT people. People didn't come out of the closet." This is something that he says, and here the acquiring will happen, contrary to what was happening in the case of Martina, the previous research participant. Here the acquiring will happen, and it will happen in the way of imitation of the attitudes of the British people that he could observe. And finally, the acquiring can happen with an innovation. And on the following slide, we will have an example of innovation regarding a practice. And a practice where we will be talking about religious practices, namely going to the Sunday services. Jolanta, who comes from Trzebnica, it's another Polish town, but lives in London, says about her religious practices. Herself raised a Catholic, she goes to different churches here in the UK because she, as she says, to use her own words, she diversifies it for herself. So obviously, it is something that she doesn't necessarily imitate from what she observes in the British society. She just picks and chooses from the offer that she has available here, also to compare from what she learned herself going all her life to the Roman Catholic Church. So this is about the acquiring, this first stage of social remitting. As you could see, we can have three different attitudes, three different reactions to acquiring a novelty, be it a new thing, idea, or practice. And the three reactions are resistance, imitation, and innovation. The second stage of the process of social remitting is the transfer, when the individual tries to pass the novelty to the wider society or just a small group back in the place of origin. And this transfer obviously can happen when the individual is here in the UK and is communicating with their significant others back in Poland, but also after the return migration or during visits back in Poland. So here a handful of information about the transfer. It occurs when the effect of what an individual has acquired are moved from a migrant to another person and from one situation to another. From one social-cultural context to the other. So I think it's self-explanatory. It's something that we already said. The effects of acquiring are rooted in the new contexts back in the country of origin and have the same use. This will be in the imitation, but can also have a new use, and this will be an example of innovation. Similarity of contexts. For instance, when somebody is using the new things acquired regarding the wedding, or when somebody is trying to transfer the novelties to a sports club back in Poland, makes the transfer more possible when the context is similar. And also, it's very important to mention that the language the person uses to explain the novelty, to try to convince the community back at home to the novelties is very important. So it's important to use the same syntax, the same language, the same vocabulary as the people who an individual is trying to convince to use a new thing, to change their values and ideas, or to change their practices. Migrants can offer an alternative to the local patterns of behavior by giving an example. So, for instance, let's take the example of this sports club. In the sports club, when first is a person who goes to train every day and is giving an example of new training practices, this is the good ground for the transfer to occur and to have the effect actually that others will adopt the novelty. They can either use a new thing or talk about the new idea, importantly with the same language as the locals would, or practice the new behavior. Migrants can be active in promoting the novelties and thus transferring them. And here, let's look at the two examples of the people who are particularly active in promoting these novelties. And Ksenia, who comes from Trzebnica and returned to Trzebnica after her migration to Scotland, says that since she returned from Scotland, quote unquote, I've been fighting for everything. Now, first of all, I'm fighting for in vitro fertilization. She says this is something that she could observe here in the United Kingdom. Free access funded by the NHS to in vitro fertilization. Also, more acceptance towards this method of getting pregnant. And back in Poland, she tries to convince people to be more open toward in vitro, also among her prayer group in the church. And Kasia says about the different contexts of transferring the novelty, especially new practices. This is the context of work, which is a very good context of transferring the novelties, because sometimes the contexts are similar, and that was particularly the case of Kasia, who in Britain worked as a carer in a care home. And she, after her return to Poland, she also worked as a medical staff in an elderly care home. So when she arrived back in Poland, she observed that carers have been treated like cleaners. And I convinced them to make extracurriculum courses, and now there are one level higher. She also introduced new things when she convinced her manager to change the colors of the uniforms for cleaners, for nurses, but also for carers, so that everybody has different colors. This is something. Color of uniform. Sorry, this is something that she observed back in Britain during her work in an elderly care house. So, as we already said, we already analyzed the process of acquiring, the process of transfer, of social remittances, and finally, the last stage is the effect. When this novelty, be it idea, thing or practice, gets accepted or not in the community back in the place of origin. So again, there are three possible reactions to transfer, and those are resistance, imitation, and innovation again. And resistance obviously occurs when other people back in the place of origin reject the novelties in a conscious or unconscious manner. Imitation, when other people imitate the use of a thing, an idea, or practice that come from abroad. Here, for instance, when the cleaners, carers, and nurses got the new color of uniform, and they just accepted it and didn't introduce any novelties. But it worked as it was transferred. And finally, innovation, when other people in a reflexive way introduce the novelties, maybe in a different context, maybe with a different use. And here I would like to give special attention to the process of resistance, because it's really interesting to try to understand why people back in the place of origin do not accept the novelties from abroad. And here, when we asked our research participants about why their families, the places back in their place, in their workplace, wouldn't accept the novelties, they said, I think that people are afraid of new things and that they are a little suspicious. But also it depends on on how much the habits are rooted. So, for instance, a lot of our interview partners, a lot of our research participants found that it was very difficult to introduce the driving culture that they acquired in England. It was difficult to transfer it back to Poland because other drivers just had a different driving culture, one that is not friendly towards other users of car users, but also people who walk and cross the streets. So here the quotation: I returned to Poland and was driving. There was a guy who was waiting to join my road, and I gave the way to him. They were almost honking at the horn. How is it possible? I was astonished. So obviously it's difficult to change it when you're just an individual trying to be a friendly driver to your to other users of the road. Thank you very much for listening